everybody, it's Brent in Central Arkansas. Another video for you today. I'm out at the Lazy Garden, and today's topic or video is about high production tomatoes. So how do you increase tomato production? Now, I'm not talking about making it last longer. High production typically means, in a lot of ways when you think about it, is extending the season of tomato so that it grows longer and that plant produces more tomatoes. That's usually what people think about, I think, when they're talking about high production. Possibly they're talking about new cultivars that were scientifically bred, and especially lately it seems determinants, where you get a lot of tomatoes on the plant in a shorter period of time, so it's a high production in order to beat the heat or something like that. But my topic today for you is different. It's about fruit setting itself. Now, when pollen is very fragile. In certain temperatures too high, like above 90, or at night if it gets above 70, or it gets too cold, like when it's below 60, 65 degrees, or when it's rainy or too humid like in Florida, or it's way too hot in like Arizona. All of that stuff limits the viability of pollen. In other words, the pollen's not good. And so tomatoes have a limited environment which they can fruit and set fruit. Now, they grow in various environments when it's not setting fruit. You'll know, especially if you live in the South, during July and August, if you can keep the plants alive, they'll start picking up again in September and start producing again. The plant will survive through the summer, you know, if you treat it halfway decent, and it'll pick up production again in the fall. And so you lose that 2-month window or so in the deep South. This is an example talking about the heat aspect of it. You lose those 2 months, and that's because the pollen just isn't good. And you'll notice that the plants will either quit producing or their flowers will pop open and then they'll drop off. And that's because they didn't get pollinated. That is key for production in tomato. It has to be pollinated. The pollen transfers within the flower. It's a perfect flower. The pollen transfers from the anthers to the stigma within the flower itself, and that the pollen goes to the stigma and it goes down into the ovaries and signals the tomato to start growing and the seeds start developing. If it's not fertilized from pollination, that flower will drop off. Well, what I'm talking about is different. What if a tomato does not need to be pollinated? In other words, the pollen doesn't have to fall. It doesn't have to stick to the stigma. The pollen grains, or the chemical parts of the grains, don't have to transfer to the ovary to make it begin growing. I believe it has something to do with the hormones more than the actual, it triggers hormones within the plants. And so the plants don't know if a fruit is not pollinated, the plant knows not to produce the hormone that makes it start growing. In my particular case, and with my line of tomatoes, what I'm developing is something called parthenocarpy. And what parthenocarpy does, is the way I understand it, is the hormone triggers regardless of pollination. And so when there's no pollination, because of any environmental condition that I talked about, whether it's rain, humidity, too hot, too cold, any of that, it does not matter. The hormone will kick in and the tomato will start growing anyway. Because the tomato doesn't get fertilized, pollinated, and therefore fertilized, the tomato cannot have seeds in it. And so, let me tap the back of the camera so I can see what you see here. Come on. I hate it when this GoPro does that. Anyway, it looks like it's not going to do it. where'd I leave off? So the tomato's going to grow anyway because the hormone is triggered. I think that's what my form of parthenocarpy does. It produces the hormone whether or not it gets pollinated. So a question I get a lot of times is, if it doesn't get pollinated and there's no seed, how do you save seed? Well, it's very easy, because my tomatoes are just like every other tomato. When the environment's right, just like all other tomatoes, it does produce seed. And in fact, there is absolutely no difference between my tomato lines and normal tomatoes, normal being all the stuff that's out there now. There's no difference at all, other than if the pollen doesn't pollinate, the tomato will grow anyway. So on my tomatoes, you get, when the pollen is good, you get seeds. When the pollen doesn't perform, is not viable, you get a tomato anyway. And so for that reason alone, production is improved. Now, I've grown my tomatoes next to hybrids. And hybrids, if you understand what hybrids are, they have something called hybrid vigor. And my lines have outperformed hybrids. And the lines that I used were open pollinated or very near open pollinated. They're very productive, and that's because they produce tomatoes on every single flower. It's just a fantastic, what's it called? Genetic capability. Now, to answer another question, no, these tomatoes are not genetically modified. I did not receive pollen or something weird. A bee didn't bring something weird from some genetically modified plant or something like that. Parthenocarpy exists in the world naturally. You have the plant's capability to produce parthenocarpic fruit occurs because most often the plant developed that capability in order to keep animals or wind or whatever, not really wind, more animals, to keep them eating the fruit even when the pollen's not available, so that the birds or the other animals will continue to come to the plant and eat it and disperse it in their waste or whatever when they travel different places. So it's the transport of the next generation wide. If the plant didn't use parthenocarpic fruit to do that, there would be periods of time where it's too hot or too cold or what have you, and the animals that come to get the fruit would stop coming because the plant's not producing the fruit. So it happens and occurs in nature on its own. And so how it come to me was, I heat stressed and water stressed tomatoes in order to improve upon tomatoes from my location, because being in the deep south, the tomato set during July and August is not that great. And so what I did was, as a hobby, I started crossing and breeding tomatoes. I did squash first, and then I moved into tomatoes. And my only intent was to improve some lines of tomatoes of my own growing, my own crossing and breeding, that do better where I live. And what happened was, what I think of is a miracle. A mutant evolved. A mutant evolved amongst several hundred plants that I was growing. It was the only one plant that developed the capability to set fruit even when it was really hot and water stressed. The plant it was like miraculous. I was just out in the garden and looking at things. I'm like, why is this plant, oh, that plant right there is doing so great, that's the one I'm going to carry forward. And so I knew nothing about parthenocarpy. And so I looked at the tomato, I waited for them to mature, and I started cutting them open. I'm like, dang, none of these tomatoes have seeds in them. How in the heck am I going to save this beautiful plant so that I can continue developing it for my area, for heat set? And so fruit after fruit after fruit I was cutting open, and there was no seeds in it at all. And I just, one day I'm like, how is it that they're growing if they don't have seeds in it? Did they abort, or all that? So I started looking into it. Well, it was getting close to, I'd say mid-fall, early winter, and the plant had not produced any seeds for me, and I wanted to continue it. So I developed the grow room I use today, and for the sole purpose of keeping that plant alive and trying to get seed out of it. And so that's where it started. That was about a decade ago. And since that time, I've been breeding this fabulous mutant into all kinds of tomatoes: paste tomatoes, beefsteak tomatoes, slicer tomatoes, cherry tomatoes, pear tomatoes, dwarf tomatoes. I've just got so many lines now because the capability is passable by breeding, natural breeding. So the point of all this is it's not GMO, it's natural. Now that I've explained that, which I'm sure took 5 minutes of your time, I'm going to go around and I'm going to show you what I'm doing to evaluate the second generation of many crosses that are out here in the Lazy Garden. Almost all of these tomatoes out here right now behind me, and that I've shown before in other videos, are the second generation of crosses with my mutant, a large beefsteak called Brandy Bear. That was the majority of the one I did the crosses with because it's an exceptional cultivar / variety. And so I crossed it with many of them, like Cherokee Purple, Purple Dog Creek, Fortunia, San Marzano, just a lot of them. And so I've got all those out here. And you have to, the mutant capability comes through, the genetic capability comes through in the second generation mostly. It does some in the first generation, but it's rare. But in the second generation, it expresses about 25% of the time. And so I have to determine amongst all these tomatoes, being the second generation, which of the tomatoes have the parthenocarpic ability. So if I'm growing 10 of each type of those that I was talking about, each cross, then I may get 1, maybe 2 that are parthenocarpic. I may get none, and I may get 4. It's not a precise thing, but you have to find a way. I had to find a way to quickly determine if it's parthenocarpic or not, and whether or not to destroy that plant or just to continue eating it as fruit only. So parthenocarpy in all these crosses is the number one goal, and then after that is production, plant structure. I was having a hard time thinking of that, and taste. All those come in after parthenocarpy. And so there's 2 methods I've found where I can test for parthenocarpy, and both of them means removing the stigma. The stigma of the flower is the very pointy, sticky end of the style, the female part that's within every flower of every tomato plant. That little sticky part, if you don't have that sticky part, pollen won't touch it and it won't travel up the style to the baby tomato. And so you have to remove, you have to do one of 2 things. You have to remove the pollen cone from around that so no pollen falls on it, or you can cut it off. And so the second one is what I'm doing now because it's a lot faster. I call it bud cutting. So I will take some scissors and I will cut the very end of the flower off. And what I typically do is just cut a closed bud in half. So let me show you that. All right, I'm out here at the plant that I'm going to do for you, and you'll see that this tomato flower bud is not open yet. So what I'm going to do is, these are snips. I use them to cut my zip ties. That's what I use them for primarily. I also use them for bud cutting. And so I'm going to remove half of that flower just like that. Flower bud before it opens. Once it opens, it's too late because it could pollinate. It could have pollinated, because once it opens, it's called anthesis. At anthesis, the pollen is ready to start dropping, and any wind or any movement a lot of times will do that. See, if you look at that flower right there, there's a little bitty kind of a center there. That center is the style, and all around it, the yellow meat there, if you will, those are the anther cones that contain pollen. That's the male part. And so I cut off the sticky end part there by doing that, and that flower is now incapable of making a tomato in normal circumstances. I'm going to do it, I'm kind of doing it differently than I normally do. So I'm going to do it with all these flowers here. All right, so what you're seeing here is 4 flowers I quickly rendered incapable of setting fruit in normal circumstances. Now I'm going to put something on it that tells me I did it to this plant at this area. And what I use here, let me put the little snips up there. What I use is a tomato clip with a blue piece of flagging tape, I guess that's what you call it. And I put it around the area where I did it. And so now I have this blue piece sitting here, and after like a week or so I'll come back out, and these are going to open anyway, even though the part has been cut off that can transfer pollen down to the baby fruit. It can't get fertilized, and it'll still open regardless. And so I'll come back and then we'll take a look and see if it's produced a little baby tomato that's starting to grow. So I did these a few days ago, and you can see they're already opening, and you can see where the anther cone, the little piece that's shaped like this that goes around the female part, has been cut. A good bit of it's been cut out. But anyway, like I was saying, the flowers are open. I'll show you another one real quick right over here. And here. It's called bud cutting. That's what I called it. I'm the first I know of to do it, and so it's been done. So I get to name it. Anyway, sometimes I use yellow because right over there I have some colored flags already for other uses, and I run out of blue a couple days ago, so I use yellow in some cases. So let's go down the line real quick, and you can see a sea of little blues just all along here, because I now have done all of these lines of tomatoes. I hope you're not getting too dizzy with me walking down here. All of these lines of tomatoes, some of them, it looks like this one was one, didn't have flowers, it's not producing. Remember, this is a second generation of a cross, and so the genetics of the other aspects of the plant are going all over the place between the 2 different parents. So there's aspects of it like poor production or poor flowering and all kinds of other things. But we're focusing on parthenocarpy. Look at that, all those are open already. And so the flower still thinks it might get pollinated. So yeah, lots of blue all along here. And the other form of making sure is called emasculation. And emasculation is a pain in the butt, because what you got to do is you got to take a pair of tweezers and pull off well, I'll tell you how. I have a video up on how to make your own tomato cross. Look that video up, and I emasculate one for a cross, and that's just absolutely perfectly visual for you to look at what it means to emasculate. But I'm seeing promise here. I'm getting an indication of parthenocarpy is high fruit sets, and even with all the rain we've had, all these are setting fruit. That's an indicator. It is not the qualifier, and so there's a really good chance that all those have seeds in them. The bud cutting, you can't get away from that. The bud cutting will tell me either it'll fall off, or it won't produce a tomato. Another way to check for parthenocarpy is emasculating. If you look in this one here, I've got 3 flower buds. I took everything off but the style and stigma, the female parts. Bee or any pollinator is not going to be attracted to that because there's no yellow. So I've got 3 there to test, and I put the blue flag here as well, so I'll know. I did one over there as well, and I'm starting to do emasculation additionally to the bud cutting. And tomato breeding for parthenocarpy, this time of year is awesome. It is beginning of July, and we've been in the 90s for a long period of time now, more in the mid 90s than low 90s, and definitely upper 80s. And so what happens with most tomatoes is they stop setting fruit. Now the fruit that's already been set at the bottom will remain there, and they will ripen pretty good most of the time. But as you get higher in the plant, they stop producing, and that's because the pollen desiccates, and there's other reasons. The plant gets stressed and it doesn't want to produce. There's just lots of reasons. But parthenocarpy is fantastic because you're not limited by plant stressors. The plant is, the hormone continues to grow. The hormone that starts the growth again after a flower is pollinated persists in the genetics of parthenocarpy in my plants. I call it PAT-B, P-A-T-B, and that's parthenocarpy for my particular lines. I'm going to show you a couple examples of plants that are doing really well, in my opinion, towards achieving some goals. One here, if you'll look here, this is a cross with Purple Dog Creek. And Purple Dog Creek I like because it sets trusses that are close to the stem that can support bigger fruit without breaking, and they support big fruit, nice round, more or less symmetrical fruit. They do have a little bit of a problem with cracking, but I think I can weed that out in the next generation a little bit more. So it's definitely this particular plant, and why it's so good this time of year is I've already cut the buds here, and I can see that this plant is growing anyway. Now these tomatoes right here, this one and this one, I've cut the buds and they're growing, so I know they're going to be seedless, and I'll validate that when the fruit ripen and I cut them open. But if you follow it up here, I've got them growing on the top of the trellis now, and if you follow it up here, they're continuing to set fruit in the heat. That is the easiest way of all the methods I've talked about. Cut buds, emasculating, all that. The easiest way is just wait for it to get really hot and just look. The problem with that, I find, is that it's too hard for me to get my next generation of growth in, so I try to determine more early on if they're parthenocarpic or not. So sometimes, like this one, I didn't evaluate at all, and it's growing and it's still setting a little bit of fruit, but I don't have any on this one yet, and I'm not sure if it's going to. So really, for the Purple Dog Creek, I've got 3 flags here. It's a yellow, white, and blue, and that means I've assessed that it's already parthenocarpic. And so when I cut it open and validate that it has no seeds, I've already saved seed from this particular plant, so I'll know that this is one to continue. Anyway, I forget what I was talking about before I saw the flags there and went off on that. But anyway, yeah, I only need 1 plant from, I don't even need 1 plant from each group of plants. Like this is a cross with Purple Dog, and I've got the 1 plant for sure, and potentially others. We'll see how they do, but I've got new tomato plants planted, and I'm going to replace these if they don't show signs of parthenocarpy. So I only need 1 from each grouping, but if I don't get a grouping, like the cherry tomatoes down here, I've got 2. if you see here the different color. I've got two that are definitely parthenocarpic out of, how many did I plant? 1, 2, 5 different varieties here of potentials, and I've got 2 that are definitive carry forwards. So not every variety is going to produce a parthenocarpic example, but I don't need 100 different lines of parthenocarpic tomato fruits. I just need good crosses that create great tomatoes with great plant structure, taste, and ability to set fruit in high heat. Now, I know from experience, if it sets in high heat, it will set in colder temperatures too, because again, it's not dependent upon pollen. Let me show you another line down here that looks promising. Let me see if I can find it here. I think it's this one, yes. Now I did. This one's cut bud right here. Let me touch the back of the camera so I can see what you see. This one's a cut bud and it is growing. And if you follow it up here, you can see all these little tomatoes are growing. This one is aggressive parthenocarpic, and I can tell because they grow really quickly instead of delaying a little bit. So this plant is exceptional, and what I really like about it is it's got the yellow and no cracking. So it's a little bit of a smaller plant, but that's okay for now. As long as it has parthenocarpy and the yellow color, I wanted to get a yellow fruit, and this one's got great aggressive behavior and great parthenocarpy. All right, we'll wrap this video up. Now, this breeding, my tomatoes that have the genetic capability of parthenocarpy, is my absolute top priority for breeding work. And it interests me so incredibly much because the potential of it and what it can do for all of us in the world is extend the season, grow when it's too hot, too cold, all that, grow in areas where you couldn't grow up before. All that is so wonderful that I just can't ignore it, even in retirement. Now, I've approached a geneticist, the company's called Veronomics, and I'm working with them to isolate the genetic trait that causes this parthenocarpy. And I've sent altogether about 200 plants roughly, so in the second generation, so they can tell which ones have and don't have parthenocarpy. And so I'm hoping, it's been a while I've been with them, I'm hoping that they will tell me soon, pretty soon, because they're a somewhat relatively new company, and they've just opened another facility on the West Coast. They are still on the East Coast, so they're on both coasts. And so I partner with them more or less. I'm contracted with them, and so they are looking at those 200 examples of plants that I gave them on 2 different periods of times at the second generation, when it can be parthenocarpic or not, and they're trying to isolate it. And the purpose of that is to determine what genetic trait causes that. So my camera died. I think I left off where I was talking about the trait. So the trait I call PAT-B, P-A-T-B, stands for parthenocarpy-Brent B, PAT-B. So if the goal of me working with Veronomics is to isolate the trait, where exactly it is on the millions upon millions of genes in the tomato genome, where it is exactly, so that I can patent it. And we're going to share the patent, provided we can get to that point. Still waiting. But anyway, if I get to that point and we're able to go to patent pending, there's more I can talk about it. There's all kinds of, I'm freed up some, and I can start making sure that it gets out to everyone. Now, the reason why it's important that I patent it instead of someone else patenting it is, for example, if people have been asking me for the seeds, when are you going to sell the seeds? When are you going to sell the seeds? Well, first off, I don't want to sell the seeds, because if anybody else, especially in major ag, gets my genetic material, what they'll do is they'll exploit it. Potentially they'll exploit it, they will patent it, and then they will control whether or not it gets out to you or not. They can choose not to release the genetics. And the reason they may do that is because they make so much money in what they're doing right now. It's like anything. If something is working fantastic, why mess with it? And so what'll happen is they could kibosh the genetic material, and really that hurts everyone. So I want to do that. That's the primary reason I want ownership of this specific trait, because it's so wonderful. I want to make sure it gets out. I'm I'm almost 58, and I don't have a lot of time left. And so I want to make sure that before I go, it is out there, out and about for everybody to enjoy. And greedy, money-hungry people, whether, you know, I'm not saying who, because I don't know who, I just know it happens all the time where people steal other people's work and patent it. Just look at countries, whole countries do that. They take, I will name one, China, and they take and they reverse engineer or patent or do, you know, stuff like that with stuff that we create. And so if you don't think an individual or an ag company that stands to make a ton of money or lose a ton of money won't do what I just described to you, you're not living in reality. And so, yeah, and speaking of that, this made me so paranoid at one point. I've got cameras all over the property, and I'm monitoring, and it directly uploads to the internet. I'm also taking this time to talk to you about Pat B and the genetic capability to establish that this is mine. This is my discovery, my breeding, my everything, so that if I have to go to court, I've got a trail. And so that's the backbone of it. Now, do I want to make some money off of it? I get that question too. Yeah, of course. If you work on something really hard for 10 years, and I'm talking almost 24/7, 365 days a year, I've been working on this for a decade, 10 years. And, you know, of paranoia and frustration and literally blood, sweat, and tears on this, of course I want to get a little something out of it. Don't be silly. Don't ask me that question. That's silly. Of course I do. I want to get a little bit. The thing is, I'm becoming discouraged with it. I don't know if something's going to come out of it. But I promise you this, one way or the other, I've got a release plan. It's going to make it out there one way or another. I'm going to make sure of it. I don't need the money. I'm fairly comfortable in retirement, but I want, more than anything else, I want it out there. So that's probably too much information. I shouldn't be telling you all this, but I've been keeping it inside for a really long time, and I'm getting tired of holding it in. Anyway, this is a kind of unusual video, isn't it, compared to what I normally do. I wanted to say that if this means anything to you, and especially with this video, please share it. I am not a fake or a phony. This is real, and the more it's out there, the more it helps me and helps all of us. And so I'm asking you to share the video. Please share the video. Other than that, if you want to subscribe to my channel, that'd be great. Like the video, gets the algorithm working in my favor. It helps me grow my channel, and I get some residual income a month from doing that, $200. It's not a lot. I'm not a great big channel. I don't do things like other people. Oh man, that's a beautiful woodpecker right over there while I'm talking, just landed. Anyway, I got distracted. So yeah, like, share, especially comment. I like talking to you. I like it when you comment. I like talking about anything. I can talk about anything. I don't get mad. I don't get upset. I'm not a fragile little thing. A snowflake has been coined a lot lately. So yeah, like, subscribe, and comment especially. This is Brent, you guys. I appreciate you, and we'll see you in the next video.
How long do we gotta stay here for people we don't know in one lines? All of the clothes are designer, fast cars and who knows who. Yeah, I know what they wanna say. They're gonna ask me if I'm gonna make it. I don't care if I'm gonna have to fake it, long as I can be real.